ones executed, orders signed by the highest authorities in the Imperium. And the worst part? None of it was a mistake. What do you do when the institution you serve is built on the bodies of the innocent? I was a good servant once. My name is Silas Dren, and for 23 years I have served the Ordo Hereticus as an archivist of the 4th rank, a keeper of forbidden histories, a compiler of truths too dangerous for the common faithful to comprehend. I tell you this not as confession but as testimony, spoken into the void between what we believe and what we are, recorded here in the final hours before my name joins the ranks of the disappeared, those countless souls whose service ended not in glory but in silence. The Imperium is vast beyond mortal comprehension, a machine of such staggering complexity that no single mind can grasp its workings, and I was content for decades to be a small cog in that machine, to catalogue horrors committed in the Emperor's name and find solace in the certainty that every act of violence served a greater purpose. I processed reports of Exterminatus declarations with steady hands. I cross-referenced lists of executed planetary governors with calm efficiency. I maintained databases of purged populations without question, because I believed, truly and completely, that the architects of these decisions possessed wisdom I could never fathom, that their burden was heavier than mine, that the calculus of survival in a galaxy drowning in darkness required sacrifices I was blessed not to comprehend fully. The work was tedious, demanding absolute precision and unwavering discretion, and I performed it with the dedication of one who knows his place in the cosmic order. My quarters in the fortress monastery on Ophelia VII were small but sufficient, a cell of grey stone with a cot, a prayer stand, and a single picked slate for devotional readings. I rose each morning at the 4th bell, attended the dawn liturgies with my fellow archivists, consumed a ration of synthesized protein and recycled water, and descended into the vaults where the Inquisition keeps its deepest secrets. The vaults themselves were a labyrinth carved into bedrock, corridor after corridor of data stacks protected by void shields, genalocked doors, and servitor sentries whose eyes glowed red in the perpetual twilight. Temperature was maintained at exactly 12 degrees Celsius to preserve the ancient cogitators and parchment scrolls, and the air tasted of machine oil and sanctified incense. My supervisor, Interrogator Valence, was a severe woman with augmetic eyes that clicked and whirred when she focused on you, a veteran of 40 years in the archives who spoke rarely and never smiled. She approved my work without comment, which I understood to mean I was performing adequately. In all those years I never questioned my purpose. I never doubted that the horrors I catalogued were necessary. I never imagined that faith itself could become a weapon turned inward, a blindfold woven from devotion that prevented us from seeing the truth of what we served. The assignment that changed everything arrived on a morning indistinguishable from any other. Interrogator Valence summoned me to her office, a cramped space lined with ancient texts bound in leather that might once have been human, and informed me that I had been selected for a priority compilation project. The Inquisitor Lord Xerxes Morn required a comprehensive historical analysis of Operation Cleansing protocols implemented across the Segmentum Obscurus over the past millennium, with particular focus on doctrinal justifications and strategic outcomes. It was an honor, she explained, her augmetic eyes clicking as they adjusted focus on my face, searching perhaps for any sign of hesitation or pride. Few archivists ever received direct commissions from Inquisitor Lords. The work would require access to sealed vaults, normally restricted to interrogators and above, clearance granted under Morn's personal authority, and monitored by automated surveillance that would record my every keystroke and eye movement. I was to compile, synthesize, and present my findings in a bound codex within 6 standard months, working alone to ensure absolute security. Valence handed me a data wafer containing access codes and left without another word, the door sliding shut behind her with a pneumatic hiss that seemed unusually final. I returned to my cell that night and prayed for 3 hours, thanking the Emperor for this opportunity to serve at a higher level, asking for the clarity and wisdom to fulfill my duty with precision and honor. Sleep came slowly. The fortress monastery's walls were thick, but I could still hear the distant chanting of the Adepta Sororitas conducting midnight vigils in the chapel 5 levels above, their voices rising and falling like waves against stone, beautiful and mournful in equal measure. I wondered if Inquisitor Lord Morn would find my work satisfactory. I wondered what insights he sought from the data, what patterns he hoped I would uncover. I did not yet understand that some patterns, once perceived, cannot be unseen, that certain truths corrode the foundations upon which faith is built, that the Imperium's survival depends as much on what its servants do not know as on what they do. The sealed vaults occupied the lowest level of the archive complex, accessible only through a maglev platform that descended for nearly 4 minutes into the planetary crust. I made my first journey there at dawn on the 3rd day after receiving my assignment, clutching the data wafer in one sweating palm while reciting the litany of focus under my breath. The platform's walls were bare adamantium marked with purity seals and warning icons depicting skulls superimposed over closed eyes. A reminder that knowledge itself could be contamination. When the doors opened, I found myself in a chamber vastly larger than anything I had imagined. A cathedral of information stretching away into shadow, its ceiling lost somewhere overhead. Data stacks rose like monoliths, each 30 meters tall and humming with the power of sleeping cogitators. Between them walked servitors on predetermined routes, their cybernetic components clicking and whirring, their remaining organic parts withered and pallid. The air here was colder than in the standard archives, cold enough that my breath misted with each exhalation. I approached the central authentication shrine, a pulpit of brass and iron surmounted by a bronze aquila, and inserted the data wafer into the receptacle. Machinery engaged with a sound like grinding teeth. Light poured from the aquila's eyes, scanning my retinas and genetic markers, while a synthesized voice intoned clearance protocols in High Gothic. Access granted. I was directed to Station 7 in subsection Theta 9, a desk of dark wood that looked almost quaint amidst the technological enormity surrounding it, equipped with a cogitator terminal and a hooded reading lamp that cast a small circle of amber light. I sat and activated the terminal. The initial document manifest populated slowly, line after line of file designations appearing on the green-lit screen, each tagged with threat classifications and access restrictions that had been temporarily suspended under Morn's authority. I selected the first file at random, expecting to find the usual template of an operation cleansing, the standard format I had reviewed hundreds of times before. Heretical outbreak detected. Investigation conducted. Guilty parties identified. Sentence carried out. Population cleansed. Emperor praised. The first document was indeed formatted according to standard protocols, but something in the content made me pause and read more carefully. The world in question was Temperance Prime, an agri-world in the Gothic sector, population 17 million, designated for cleansing following reports of heretical activity among the planetary leadership. The investigation summary occupied 3 pages of dense text describing widespread corruption, demonic possession of the governor and his council, evidence of chaos worship embedded in planetary administration. All of this was unremarkable. But then came the annexes, supplementary reports filed by investigating agents before the final authorization was given. The first annex was written by an interrogator named Katrin Voss, and her account described a world functioning with unusual efficiency, agricultural yields exceeding projections by 14%, tithe deliveries consistently on schedule, a population demonstrating high levels of devotion and compliance. Her investigation of the governor and council revealed no evidence of possession or heresy. The accusation had originated from a rival noble house seeking to seize planetary control, she concluded, and recommended no action beyond increased surveillance. This report was dated 3 weeks before the cleansing order. The second annex was written by a senior inquisitor dispatched to review Voss's findings. He concurred with her assessment, but noted that the rival house in question had strong connections to the administratum and the ecclesiarchy, that denying their accusation would create political complications, and that Temperance Prime's strategic value was minimal. His recommendation was for limited action against the governor alone, a surgical removal to satisfy political pressures without mass casualties. This report was dated 2 weeks before the cleansing, The final annex was the authorization itself, signed by an Inquisitor Lord whose name had been redacted, ordering complete planetary cleansing via orbital bombardment and atmospheric incendiaries. 17 million souls. No stated justification for the escalation from the investigators' recommendations. No explanation for why a world deemed loyal required total extermination. Just a signature and a date and the mechanical activation of weapons that turned an entire planet into a crematorium. I sat very still, staring at the screen, trying to reconcile what I had just read with everything I believed about the Inquisition's methods. Surely there was context I was missing. Additional evidence gathered between the investigators' report and the final order. Intelligence too sensitive to commit to the record. I searched the file thoroughly, examining every attached document and data fragment, finding nothing that explained the discrepancy. 17 million people incinerated because it was politically convenient, because their planet's strategic value was insufficient to outweigh the bureaucratic cost of defending them. The words on the screen seemed to shimmer and distort as I read them again. I closed the file and opened another, telling myself this was an anomaly, a single case of flawed judgment among thousands of righteous acts. The second file concerned a mining colony on Gradius 9, population 8,000, cleansed for suspected genestealer infiltration. The investigation notes were brief but conclusive. No evidence of Xenos contamination detected. No biological markers in planetary screening. No behavioral anomalies. The local Arbeits precinct had reported increased worker unrest over labor conditions, and an administratum economic analyst suggested that eliminating the existing population and replacing them with more compliant labor stock would improve long-term productivity. The cleansing was authorized on economic grounds, justified in the official record as preventative action against potential future corruption. 8,000 people incinerated from orbit so that their replacements would be more obedient. I opened a third file, then a fourth, then a dozen more. Each one revealed variations on the same pattern. Decisions made not from necessity but convenience, populations exterminated not because they had fallen to heresy, but because allowing them to live created complications for Imperial administration, because their continued existence was inconvenient to powerful interests, because the Inquisition existed in a system where the cost of innocent life carried less weight than the cost of political friction. The hours passed without my noticing. The servitors continued their patrols, their footsteps echoing in the vast chamber. The temperature seemed to drop further, though the cogitator's climate display showed no change. I worked through document after document, compiling notes with mechanical precision, while some deeper part of my mind struggled to process what I was reading. Not every cleansing followed this pattern. Many of the files contained exactly the evidence of heresy and corruption that justified the Imperium's terrible judgment. Worlds genuinely lost to chaos or Xenos influence, populations so thoroughly compromised that their destruction was the only mercy available. But those righteous acts were interspersed with others that had no such justification, orders carried out not to save humanity, but to maintain the administrative convenience of an empire too vast to distinguish between necessary sacrifice and bureaucratic murder. By the time the servitors activated the chamber's evening illumination sequence, a dim red glow that bathed everything in shades of blood and shadow, I had reviewed 47 files. 23 of them contained evidence of cleansing actions authorized against innocent or ambiguously guilty populations, decisions made not by ignorant or corrupted officials, but by senior members of the Inquisition who understood exactly what they were doing. I logged out of the terminal and returned to the maglev platform, ascending through the stone in silence, emerging into the main archive levels where other scribes and archivists moved between stacks with bowed heads and quiet footsteps. None of them looked at me, none of them spoke. I walked through corridors I had traversed thousands of times, and they felt different now, as though the walls had shifted slightly, as though the familiar had become subtly alien. In my cell, I knelt before the prayer stand and tried to recite the evening devotional, but the words caught in my throat. I could see the faces I had never seen. 17 million souls on Temperance Prime, 8,000 on Gradius 9, numbers transformed by narrative into people who had prayed to the Emperor and died for the crime of being inconvenient. I stayed on my knees until the stone floor numbed them, until my back ached and my vision blurred, searching for the certainty that had always sustained me, finding only questions I did not want to ask. The work continued. Each morning I descended into the sealed vaults, and each evening I returned to my cell with new horrors catalogued in my mind. The pattern revealed itself more clearly with every file I reviewed. An architecture of calculated cruelty embedded so deeply in Imperial operations that it functioned as standard procedure rather than aberration. I learned of forge worlds whose entire populations were executed after completing assigned production quotas, the Mechanicus deeming it more efficient to cycle through disposable labor than risk technological secrets spreading. I learned of hive worlds where deliberate food shortages were engineered to reduce excess population when demographic projections exceeded optimal density, starvation deployed as policy, while the administratum recorded it as natural attrition. I learned of frontier colonies abandoned to Xenos raiders, despite having months to organize evacuation, written off because the cost of rescue exceeded their economic value to the Imperium. Every act was documented with bureaucratic precision, filed and sealed and forgotten by everyone except archivists like myself, servants trained to witness horror without judgment, to process atrocity as data. The deeper I went into the records, the more I found not isolated incidents but systematic practice, a philosophy of governance that accepted mass death not as tragic necessity but as tool of control. The Imperium did not survive in spite of these acts, but because of them, its vastness maintained through selective culling, its loyalty enforced through the certainty that dissent or inconvenience carried existential consequences. I discovered files detailing the purge of entire sectors whose only crime was requesting increased autonomy, independence crushed with such overwhelming violence that neighboring systems remained compliant for generations afterward. I found records of assassinated planetary governors who had attempted to implement reforms that would have improved civilian life at minimal cost to imperial tithes, eliminated because reform itself was deemed dangerous precedent. I read reports on psyker harvest operations that exceeded quota requirements by abducting non-psykers from compliant families, children stolen and processed into the Imperium's great psychic machinery, their absence explained as divine calling while their parents wept behind closed doors. Each revelation built upon the previous one, constructing an understanding I did not want, could not reject. The moment of fracture came in my third month of research, when I accessed a file dated to the earliest years of the Imperium's founding, a period I had always imagined as more noble, more justified in its violence by the surrounding chaos. The document detailed a planetary compliance action on a world called Monarch's Rest, one of the first worlds encountered during the Great Crusade, notable because it had achieved compliance peacefully, its human population welcoming the Emperor's forces with celebration and genuine joy. The file contained vid capture records of the initial contact, images of crowds gathering in city squares, children waving improvised banners, planetary leaders offering fealty without hesitation. Monarch's Rest was technologically advanced, possessing functioning STCs and a stable government that had maintained order through the age of strife. Its integration into the Imperium should have been celebrated as a triumph of unity over isolation. Instead, 3 months after compliance was achieved, the planet was systematically dismantled. Its population was distributed across a dozen newly conquered worlds as indentured labor. Its STC technologies were confiscated by the Mechanicus and never implemented. Its planetary leaders were executed for the crime of having governed successfully without the Emperor's direct guidance, their competence deemed evidence of dangerous independence. The authorization came from the Primarch overseeing the sector, a figure whose name I will not speak even now, justified in the official record as necessary to establish proper imperial hierarchy and eliminate potential rivals to centralized authority. The population of Monarch's Rest numbered 43 million. They died slowly, worked to death on worlds they had never seen, their culture eradicated, their history erased, their crime nothing more than having survived without submitting to an authority they had willingly embraced when given the chance. I read this file 3 times, searching for the justification I had always believed must exist for even the most terrible Imperial actions. I found only pragmatism divorced from morality. Power exercised simply because it could be. Violence as demonstration rather than necessity. That night, I did not pray. I sat on my cot in the darkness, listening to the fortress monastery's ambient sounds, the distant hum of generators, the occasional clang of maintenance servitors moving through corridors, the whisper of recycled air through ventilation grills. My hands were shaking. I had spent 23 years serving an institution I believed was humanity's salvation, cataloging its sins with the faith that every sin served a greater purpose, that the architects of atrocity possessed wisdom I could not comprehend. But wisdom was not what I had found in the sealed vaults. I had found calculation, efficiency, the mathematics of control applied without moral constraint. The Inquisition did not make difficult choices between lesser evils. It made convenient choices, eliminating complications regardless of guilt or innocence, maintaining the Imperium not through justice, but through the systematic application of terror to anyone who might threaten its supremacy. Every planetary governor who woke wondering if today would bring an Inquisitor's investigation. Every citizen who understood that devotion was no guarantee of survival. Every world that paid its tithes and prayed its prayers, while knowing that loyalty might not save them if their existence became inconvenient. The whole vast structure of the Imperium rested not on the Emperor's light, but on the certainty of arbitrary destruction, fear weaponized and deployed with such consistency that it became indistinguishable from law. I had always known the Imperium was brutal, but I had believed its brutality was reactive, defensive, a terrible shield raised against the darkness pressing from all sides. What I had learned in the vaults was different. The brutality was foundational. The darkness we fought existed, yes, chaos and Xenos, and the 1,000 threats that haunted the galaxy, but we had become something just as monstrous in our response to them, a machine that consumed innocence as readily as guilt, that measured success not in lives saved, but in systems maintained, that had forgotten any purpose beyond its own perpetuation. I returned to the vaults the next morning because I did not know what else to do. The work continued. The months passed. I compiled my findings according to the assignment specifications, organizing the material chronologically and thematically, noting patterns in decision-making and authorization chains, documenting the evolution of cleansing protocols from emergency measure to standard practice. The codex grew thicker, my faith grew thinner, eroded not by sudden revelation but by accumulation, death by death, world by world, each individual atrocity small enough to rationalize until the whole mass of them became too heavy to bear. I discovered that many of the protocols I was documenting had been authored by Inquisitors who were now legends within the Ordo, figures whose wisdom was quoted in training sessions, whose methods were taught as exemplars of proper investigation. Their names appeared again and again in the authorization chains, consistent votes for maximum violence in situations where lesser responses were viable, patterns suggesting that their legendary status derived not from righteousness but from ruthlessness, from their willingness to choose expedience over mercy without hesitation or doubt. I learned the names of interrogators who had raised objections to cleansing orders and subsequently disappeared from all records, their questions answered with silence, their careers terminated, or more likely their lives. I found evidence that the Inquisition maintained internal purge lists, rosters of its own members deemed too sympathetic or too questioning, monitored and eliminated when their doubts threatened to become public. The organization I served did not tolerate dissent even within its own ranks, its survival dependent on the absolute conviction of its agents, any crack in that certainty treated as corruption requiring excision. The 5th month brought me to the core of the assignment. The documents Inquisitor Lord Morn specifically wanted analyzed, a sequence of files detailing Operation Cleansing authorizations signed by Inquisitor Lords across the past 3 centuries. This was the highest level of documentation, decisions made by the most senior figures in the Ordo, the men and women who shaped inquisitorial policy and doctrine. I expected to find evidence of careful deliberation at this level, grave consideration of each choice, the wisdom that comes from bearing ultimate responsibility. What I found was the opposite. At this level, the pretense of investigation and justification fell away entirely. Worlds were marked for cleansing based on statistical modeling and threat assessment algorithms. Populations evaluated not as collections of individual souls but as data points in resource allocation matrices. A planet might be spared or condemned based on variables like shipping route proximity, tithe production efficiency, or strategic buffer positioning, factors utterly divorced from the presence or absence of actual heresy. The Inquisitor lords who authorized these mass deaths did so with signatures scrawled across digital documents in batches, dozens of worlds condemned in single sessions, their fates decided in the time it took to verify mathematical projections and ensure proper documentation for administratum records. There was no malice in it. That was somehow worse. They were not monsters, these Inquisitor lords. They were administrators, managers of an impossible task, trying to hold together an empire spanning 1,000,000 worlds with tools inadequate to the scale, making choices no human mind was designed to make, optimizing for survival of the whole without capacity to grieve the parts sacrificed. They had become what the Imperium required them to become, so numb to atrocity that it registered only as paperwork, so convinced of their necessity that they never questioned whether the Imperium they preserved deserved preservation. Among these files, I found references to a document that was not included in my access permissions, a theoretical treatise coded as The Necessity of Darkness, authored collectively by the Inquisitorial Conclave 200 years prior. Multiple files referenced it as foundational doctrine, the philosophical justification underlying modern cleansing protocols, mandatory reading for all Inquisitors achieving Lord rank. It was sealed under clearance so high that even Morn's authority could not grant me access, but fragments were quoted in secondary sources, enough to reconstruct its central arguments. The treatise posited that humanity's survival required not just violence against external threats, but violence against itself, that a species as numerous and diverse as ours could only be held together through the elimination of deviation, that mercy itself was a luxury purchased with the blood of those deemed unworthy of receiving it. The Emperor's vision of a unified humanity could only be achieved through the systematic culling of any who might threaten that unity, not just heretics and traitors, but the merely inconvenient, the potentially disloyal, the philosophically incompatible. The Necessity of Darkness argued that creating and maintaining a culture of absolute obedience required regular demonstrations of consequence, that populations allowed to live without fear of arbitrary punishment would inevitably drift toward independence and fragmentation. Therefore, the cleansing of innocent populations served a purpose beyond immediate threat elimination. It reinforced the fundamental truth that survival in the Imperium was conditional, that no amount of loyalty guaranteed safety, that the Emperor's servants lived always under the shadow of judgment. This was not corruption of the Imperium's ideals. This was the ideals made explicit, the foundation upon which 10,000 years of governance had been constructed. The dark truth that we archivists catalogued without comprehension, that Inquisitors enforced without question, that defined humanity's collective existence in ways we were never meant to understand. I finished compiling the codex in the final week of my 6th month, a leather-bound volume 300 pages thick, filled with tables and timelines, and analytical summaries of exactly what Inquisitor Lord Morn had requested. The work was impeccable. Every citation verified, every conclusion supported by evidence, every pattern identified and documented with the precision expected of a 4th-rank archivist. I could find no flaw in it as a piece of research. It was the finest work I had ever produced, comprehensive and unflinching in its examination of Operation Cleansing protocols, and it demonstrated beyond question that the systematic execution of innocent Imperial citizens was not anomaly, but policy, not failure, but feature, woven into the fabric of how we governed ourselves with the full knowledge and approval of our highest authorities. I held the finished codex in my hands, its weight somehow enormous, despite its modest size, and I understood that I was holding a death sentence, not just for the populations documented within its pages, their deaths already accomplished, but for myself, for the mere act of comprehending what I had compiled. The Inquisition had not granted me this access because Morn wanted analysis. He had all the analysis he needed, had access to the necessity of darkness and centuries of precedent. He had granted me access because I was being tested, observed through every moment of my research, monitored to see whether I would maintain faith in the face of comprehensive revelation or whether I would break, whether I would remain useful or become another data point requiring elimination. I thought of interrogator Katrin Voss, whose honest investigation of Temperance Prime had been disregarded in favor of political convenience. I thought of the interrogators whose questions led to disappearances. I thought of all the archivists and servants who had handled this material before me, granted access, and then quietly erased. Their very knowledge of these truths deemed too dangerous to allow them continued existence. I was one of them now. I had failed the test by understanding too much, by allowing that understanding to pierce the shell of faith that was meant to insulate servants like me from the implications of our service. The question became not whether I would die, but what I would do with the time remaining. I could deliver the Codex and hope that my faithful service would outweigh my dangerous knowledge, that Morn would accept my work and assign me back to regular archival duties, that the surveillance watching me had not detected the change in my devotions, the prayers that died unspoken, the faith that crumbled into ash. This option felt like cowardice but also like wisdom, the survival instinct that had served humanity through countless dark ages, the willingness to bow one's head and endure rather than rage against what cannot be changed. Or I could attempt to expose what I had learned, compile evidence and broadcast it beyond the Inquisition's control, force other servants of the Imperium to confront these truths and make their own judgments. This option was noble perhaps, but also futile, a gesture of defiance that would be erased before it could spread, my message purged, and my name added to the countless others who had tried to shine light into places light was forbidden to reach. Or I could simply flee, abandon my post, and disappear into the vastness of the Imperium, become one of the nameless billions moving between worlds, hope that distance and anonymity would grant me some span of life beyond this place. But the Inquisition's reach was long and its memory perfect, and I knew that flight would only delay the inevitable while transforming me into exactly the kind of suspicious element that justified the very protocols I sought to escape. There was a fourth option, one I barely allowed myself to consider. I could accept what I had learned and choose to serve anyway, become like those Inquisitor lords who signed death warrants in batches, who made peace with atrocity by believing it necessary, who found a cold comfort in the mathematics of survival that overrode the human capacity for grief. This option horrified me most of all because I could feel its logic, could understand how one might arrive at such a state through years of exposure and responsibility, how mercy itself might come to seem like weakness when measured against the scale of what we faced. Perhaps this was what Morn wanted from me. Not elimination, but transformation, the hope that I would emerge from the vaults as a more effective servant, my faith replaced with pragmatism, my conscience replaced with conviction. I made my decision on a morning when the chapel bells rang for dawn services, and I did not rise to attend them. I had not attended services for 3 weeks, could not bring myself to recite prayers I no longer believed, to participate in rituals that felt like lies. The other archivists had noticed. Interrogator Valence had noticed, her augmetic eyes tracking my movements with increasing frequency, her silence more pointed each time I passed her office. The servitors in the vaults had begun pausing in their patrols when I worked, their remaining biological eyes watching me with something that might have been recognition or might have been pre-programmed alertness to behavioral anomalies. I was already marked. My death was already authorized, queued in some administrative process, waiting only for the appropriate moment to be implemented. But I could still choose how to meet it, with dignity or desperation, defiance or acceptance. I decided I would deliver the Codex to Inquisitor Lord Morn as assigned, but I would include within it a final section not requested in the original assignment specifications, an analytical conclusion where I would state plainly what the evidence demonstrated, stripping away the euphemisms and doctrinal justifications to reveal the truth in language clear enough that no one reading it could pretend misunderstanding. I would not broadcast this truth beyond the Inquisition. I would not flee. I would simply present my findings with complete honesty and let Morn make his choice, knowing that the choice was already made, that I was writing not a report but an epitaph, not for the populations destroyed by Operation Cleansing protocols, but for myself, for the man I had been before I entered the sealed vaults and learned what service truly required. I spent 2 days writing that final section, working in my cell rather than the archives, filling page after page with careful script. I documented the pattern of innocent populations destroyed for administrative convenience. I identified the systematic nature of these acts, their integration into standard operating procedure. I traced the authorization chains to their highest levels, naming Inquisitor lords whose decisions demonstrated that these protocols were not mistakes but policy. I cited the necessity of darkness and its core arguments, explaining how this philosophy had transformed the Imperium from humanity's defender into its oppressor, how we had become so focused on survival that we had forgotten what we were supposed to be surviving for, what values or hopes or visions of better future might justify the oceans of blood spilled in our name. I wrote that the Imperium was indeed beset by threats on all sides, that chaos was real, and Xenos were numerous, and the galaxy was hostile beyond measure, but that our response to those threats had become indistinguishable from them, that we had adopted the methods of tyrants while calling ourselves liberators, that we had built a civilization where loyalty meant nothing and life meant less, where the only certainty was suffering, and the only reward for service was the hope of dying before you understood what you served. I wrote that I had been a faithful servant for 23 years, and my faith had been rewarded with knowledge I could not unknow, that the Inquisition had shown me the foundations upon which it stood, and those foundations were not righteousness but ruthlessness, not wisdom but calculated cruelty, not the Emperor's light but a darkness we had chosen to embody. I wrote that I did not expect this truth to change anything, that the Imperium would continue exactly as it had, that my testimony would be filed and sealed, just like all the other inconvenient truths documented in the vaults, that the machine would grind on regardless of whether any individual understood its workings. But I wrote it anyway because I needed to believe that bearing witness mattered, that speaking truth had value even when no one was listening, that the act of refusing to lie was worth something even if it changed nothing. The final page was the hardest to write. I addressed it directly to Inquisitor Lord Morn, abandoning the formal protocols of archival reporting for direct speech. I told him that I knew what he had done by granting me access to these files, that I understood this was a test I had failed by allowing comprehension to crack my faith. I told him that I did not regret my failure because living with comfortable lies was worse than dying with uncomfortable truths, that whatever happened to me in the coming days or hours, I would face it knowing I had chosen honesty over survival, had valued my conscience more than my continued existence. I told him that I hoped someday, perhaps in centuries to come, the Imperium would evolve beyond the necessity of darkness, would find a way to defend humanity without devouring it, would remember that the individual souls we sacrificed for the collective good were not abstractions but people, each one carrying hopes and dreams and loves as real as his own. I told him that I did not hate him or the Inquisition, that I understood the impossible burden they carried, the choices no one should have to make, but that understanding did not equal acceptance, that recognizing the logic behind atrocity did not make atrocity just. I told him that I would deliver this codex in person, would stand before him and answer any questions he had, would accept whatever judgment he rendered with the dignity befitting a servant who had done his duty as he understood it. I told him that I was afraid but not ashamed, that fear was rational but shame would have been cowardice, that I hoped my example might plant some seed of doubt in another archivist someday, some other servant who would access these files and read my words, and perhaps make a different choice than I had made, though I could not imagine what that choice might be. I signed the page with my full name and rank, affixed my archival seal, and closed the codex for the final time. The audience with Inquisitor Lord Morn was scheduled for the following morning. I spent the night in my cell, not sleeping but not praying either, simply sitting in darkness and remembering my life before I entered the sealed vaults. The simple certainty that had made each day bearable, the faith that had sustained me through decades of witnessing horror, I remembered joining the Inquisition as a young man fresh from scholar training, eager to serve, convinced I had been granted sacred duty. I remembered my first assignment cataloguing execution records from a compliance action, the way my hands had shaken while entering data, the way I had told myself that every death was necessary, that the Inquisitors who ordered these acts had wisdom I did not possess. I remembered the slow process of numbing, the way horror becomes routine through repetition, the way you learn to distance yourself from what you witness by treating it as information rather than tragedy. I remembered promotions and commendations, Interrogator Valance telling me I was one of her most reliable archivists, that my work was exemplary, that I served the Emperor with distinction. I remembered feeling proud. I remembered believing every word. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now. Another Silas Dren who had existed in a simpler universe where evil was always external and justice was always righteous and service was always noble. That Silas Dren had died in the sealed vaults, killed not by heresy or Xenos, but by the truth of what his service supported, by the revelation that the Imperium he loved was built on foundations he could not accept, maintained by acts he could not justify, defended by servants who had sacrificed their humanity so completely they no longer recognized what they had become. I grieved for that lost self, for the faith that had made meaning from horror, for the certainty that had made each day bearable. But I did not wish to have him back. Better to die knowing what I knew than live believing what I had believed. The morning arrived with bells ringing across the fortress monastery, calling the faithful to their devotions. I washed my face in cold water from the basin in my cell, dressed in my cleanest robes, and collected the codex from where it lay on my cot. The leather binding felt warm against my palms, as though the words inside generated their own heat. I left my cell and walked through corridors I had traversed thousands of times, passing other archivists who did not meet my eyes, servitors who paused in their work to track my passage, automated surveillance lenses that whirred and adjusted focus as I moved. Everyone knew. Everything knew. The fortress monastery itself seemed aware of what I carried, what I intended, the choice I had made. I reached the maglev platform that would carry me to the upper levels where the Inquisitor Lords maintained their chambers, and hesitated for one final moment. Looking back at the archives that had been my world for more than 2 decades, the stacks of data and rows of cogitators and amber-lit reading stations where servants like myself processed the Imperium's secrets without understanding them. How many others had stood where I stood now, carrying similar burdens, facing similar choices? How many had delivered their truths and disappeared into silence? How many had chosen differently, accepted what they learned, transformed themselves into effective servants of a system they could not respect? The platform doors closed behind me and I began to ascend, rising through levels of increasing authority, past the standard archives and administrative offices, past the interrogation chambers and detention blocks, past the chapels and armories, ascending toward the spires where power resided and decisions were made that rippled across entire sectors. The ascent took nearly 10 minutes, time enough to reconsider everything, to turn back, to choose survival over principle. I did not turn back. Inquisitor Lord Xerxes Morn's chambers occupied the highest accessible level of the fortress monastery, a suite of rooms built into the structure's central spire with narrow windows that looked out across Ophelia Seven's grey mountains and grey sky. I had never been here before. Few archivists ever were. Our service valuable but not important enough to warrant direct contact with Inquisitor Lords under normal circumstances. 2 crusaders in ornate power armor stood guard outside the entrance, their weapons held in ceremonial readiness, their helmets revealing nothing. I announced myself and presented my identification, which they verified through scanning devices built into their gauntlets. One of them touched a control stud on the wall, and the doors opened with a sound like exhaling breath. Inside was a reception chamber appointed with austere elegance, stone walls hung with tapestries depicting the Emperor's victories, furniture of dark wood polished to reflective sheen, a carpet woven with images of the Aquila and inscribed with prayers in High Gothic. Morn himself stood before the windows, his back to me, watching the distant mountains. He was tall and thin, his black robes hanging from his frame like burial shrouds, his hair white and cropped close to his skull. When he turned to face me, I saw that his eyes were grey and depthless, old beyond measure, carrying the weight of centuries and decisions that would have broken lesser men. He did not smile. He did not need to. His presence alone conveyed authority absolute and unquestionable. The power to end lives with a word, to destroy worlds with a signature, to judge and condemn without appeal or mercy. I knelt as protocol demanded, holding the codex above my head in offering. Morn approached with slow steps that echoed on stone, his augmetic joints clicking softly. He took the codex from my hands and gestured for me to rise. I obeyed, standing with my eyes downcast, waiting. Morn carried the codex to a reading desk near the windows and opened it, his grey eyes scanning the pages with inhuman speed, his augmetic components processing information faster than biological cognition allowed. He read in silence for what might have been an hour, turning pages with careful precision, occasionally pausing to reread certain passages. I stood where I was, not moving, barely breathing, watching dust motes drift through the thin sunlight filtering through the windows. When he reached my final analytical section, I saw his expression change minutely, a tightening around his eyes, a slight narrowing of his lips. He read those pages twice, then closed the codex and set it aside. For a long moment he said nothing, simply stood looking out the windows at the mountains, his hands clasped behind his back. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost gentle, the voice of a teacher addressing a promising student who had nonetheless failed to grasp a crucial concept. He said that my work was excellent, that the research was thorough and the analysis precise, that I had fulfilled my assignment beyond expectation. He said that I had demonstrated exactly the qualities the Inquisition valued, diligence and intelligence, and unflinching honesty in the face of uncomfortable truths. He said that few archivists achieved such comprehensive understanding of the materials they processed, that most remained content to catalogue without comprehending, to witness without judging, to serve without questioning. He said that I should be commended for my dedication and insight. Then he said that I had also demonstrated why such understanding was dangerous, why most servants were deliberately kept ignorant of the full implications of their work, why knowledge itself required management and control. He said that the Imperium was indeed built on foundations I found objectionable, that Operation Cleansing protocols did indeed authorize the execution of innocent populations, that the necessity of darkness accurately described the philosophy underlying our governance. He said these things were not secrets from him or from any Inquisitor Lord, were not corruptions or failures, but essential mechanisms, tools required for humanity's survival in a galaxy that offered no mercy to the merciful, no justice to the just, no reward for virtue beyond the certainty of exploitation and destruction. Morn turned from the windows to face me directly, his grey eyes holding mine, and he explained with patient clarity why the Imperium functioned as it did. He said that humanity numbered in the trillions, scattered across 1,000,000 worlds, divided by distance and culture and doctrine into fragments that would tear themselves apart without constant pressure to maintain cohesion. He said that the threats we faced were not abstractions, that chaos corrupted entire civilizations, that Xenos species viewed humanity as prey or obstacle, that the galaxy was so hostile to our existence that any moment of weakness invited extinction. He said that mercy was a luxury that weakened rather than strengthened, that populations allowed to question authority would inevitably fragment, that the only way to hold together an empire of such scale was through absolute enforcement of absolute obedience. He said that yes, innocent people died, thousands of them every day, sacrificed for crimes they did not commit or circumstances beyond their control, but that these individual tragedies prevented larger disasters, that the fear created by seemingly arbitrary punishment kept entire sectors compliant, that the willingness to execute loyal populations demonstrated to all populations that loyalty alone guaranteed nothing, that survival required not just obedience but silence, not just faith but submission. He said that this was not ideal, that in a better universe we might govern through inspiration rather than terror, through trust rather than fear, but that we did not live in a better universe that we lived in the only universe we had, and in this universe the choice was not between justice and injustice, but between survival through cruelty and extinction through compassion. He said that every Inquisitor Lord understood this calculus, had made peace with it through years of service and responsibility, had learned to carry the weight of necessary evil without allowing it to compromise their effectiveness. He said that the necessity of darkness was not corruption of the Emperor's vision but fulfillment of it, that the Emperor himself had understood what would be required to unite and preserve humanity, that the Imperium's methods were exactly what he intended, harsh but functional, cruel but effective, maintaining our species through mechanisms that ensured we remained capable of the ruthlessness required to survive. I listened to all of this without interrupting, without protest or argument, because I understood that Morn was not trying to convince me, but explaining why my understanding changed nothing. He was showing me the view from his position, the perspective of someone who carried responsibility for outcomes measured in billions of lives, who made decisions where every option included mass death, and the only question was which deaths served strategic purpose. He was demonstrating that he was not a monster but a pragmatist, not corrupt but committed, not ignorant of the suffering he authorized but convinced that preventing greater suffering justified any individual act of cruelty. And the terrible thing was that I could follow his logic even while rejecting his conclusions, could see how someone with his responsibilities might arrive at his convictions, could understand the intellectual process that transformed slaughter into strategy, atrocity into necessity. This was the final revelation, the last truth the sealed vaults had to teach me. The Inquisition was not run by madmen or heretics. It was run by rational people who had stared into the abyss of impossible choices and chosen what they believed was the least destructive path forward, who had traded their souls for humanity's survival, who had become the darkness they fought because they believed no other option existed. They were neither heroes nor villains, but something more complex and more tragic, servants who had sacrificed everything, including their own humanity, to preserve a species that would never thank them, never understand them, never recognize that their suffering was purchased with calculations made in chambers like this one, by men like Morn, who signed death warrants with steady hands and slept peacefully afterward because they had learned to view individual lives as abstractions, numbers in equations where the only variable that mattered was the sum. Morn finished his explanation and asked me a single question. He asked if I understood what he had told me, if I grasped the necessity of what we did, if I could accept my role in this system, knowing its nature fully. He said that I had two options available to me. The first was to embrace what I had learned, to allow understanding to evolve into acceptance, to transform as so many others had transformed before me, to continue my service with eyes open and conscience silenced, to become an effective instrument of the Imperium's survival regardless of personal cost. He said that archivists who achieved this transformation were valuable, that they became candidates for promotion to interrogator rank, that my demonstrated intelligence and insight would serve the Inquisition well if I chose to channel them constructively rather than destructively. He said that this path would not be easy, that it required surrendering certain comforts that faith provided, that I would carry knowledge that would isolate me from normal human connection, but that I would serve at the highest levels, would help shape the decisions that determined humanity's fate, would bear the burden he bore with full comprehension of what it meant. The second option, he said, was to maintain my objections, to refuse the transformation, to insist that my conscience mattered more than my utility. He said that this choice would result in my immediate termination, that I would be executed as efficiently and painlessly as possible, that my name would be added to the list of servants whose knowledge made them liabilities rather than assets, that my work would be archived and my existence erased from all records, that within a month no evidence would remain that I had ever served the Inquisition or lived at all. He said that this choice was not punishment, but pragmatism, that servants who understood what I understood but refused to accept it could not be allowed to exist, that even the possibility of them sharing that understanding with others created risk the Imperium could not tolerate. He said that he bore me no malice, that he respected the integrity that made me object to what I had learned, that he even envied in some ways my ability to still feel outrage at injustice, but that respect and envy changed nothing, that the machine required certain components and destroyed those that did not fit, that my choice would determine only the manner of my end, not whether it came. I stood in Inquisitor Lord Morn's chambers, looking into his grey eyes, and I realized that I had no answer to give him, not because I was uncertain, but because both options were death, one slower than the other, one preserving my body while destroying my soul, the other destroying my body while attempting to preserve whatever remained of my soul. If I accepted his offer, I would live, would continue my service, would perhaps advance in rank and authority, but I would do so as something other than the man I had been, would make peace with atrocities I could not now imagine accepting, would sign documents authorizing the deaths of innocents while telling myself that necessity justified any act, that survival outweighed all other concerns, that the calculus of empire required calculations divorced from individual suffering. I would become like Morn himself, like all the Inquisitor lords whose names I had learned in the sealed vaults, servants who had traded their humanity for effectiveness, who had learned to sleep beside the ghosts of millions, who had convinced themselves that pragmatism was wisdom and cruelty was strength. I would be useful, I would be effective, I would be exactly what the Imperium needed, and I would hate myself with a hatred that would eventually numb into acceptance, that would transform through years and decades and centuries into the same cold pragmatism that Morn demonstrated, the same ability to view life as abstraction and death as data, the same conviction that what we did was necessary because the alternative was unthinkable. If I refused his offer, I would die, would be executed in some quiet chamber, my body disposed of efficiently, my name scrubbed from records, my entire existence erased as though I had never been. But I would die as myself, would maintain the integrity that had survived 23 years of archival work, would refuse to become what the Imperium wanted me to become, and my death would change nothing. The machine would continue grinding. The protocols would remain in effect. The innocent would continue dying for the crime of inconvenience. My defiance would be footnote in files no one would read, example cited in internal discussions of why archivists required limited access, cautionary tale whispered among interrogators about the dangers of excessive comprehension. I would die for nothing, achieve nothing, prove nothing, except that I had valued my conscience more than my survival, which was perhaps not nothing, which was perhaps everything. I told Morn that I needed time to consider, that the choice he offered was too significant to make without reflection, that I wanted to pray and meditate and examine my conscience before committing to either path. He nodded as though he had expected this response, said that I could have 3 days, that I should return to my cell and contemplate carefully, that he would wait for my answer with patience and without judgment. He said that most servants offered this choice required time, that the transformation from faithful servant to effective instrument was not instantaneous, that I should not feel ashamed of my hesitation. He returned the codex to me and gestured toward the door. I took the codex, bowed according to protocol, and left his chambers, walking past the Crusader guards with their inscrutable helmets, descending in the maglev platform through level after level of the fortress monastery, returning to the archives and then to my cell with mechanical precision, my mind empty of thought, my body moving on trained habit while some deeper part of myself struggled to process what had occurred. 3 days, 72 hours to decide between 2 forms of death, 2 ways of ceasing to exist, 2 endings that differed only in their mechanics and timing. I sat on my cot, holding the codex, looking at my hands, at the scarring on my knuckles from decades of handling ancient parchments, at the ink stains that never quite washed away, at the physical evidence of a life spent in service to an institution I could no longer believe in, could no longer justify, could no longer pretend was worthy of the faith I had given it. And I understood with sudden clarity that Morn had not offered me a choice at all. He had offered me an ultimatum dressed as option, had presented 2 paths that both served the Inquisition's interests, that both preserved the system regardless of my decision. If I accepted transformation, I would become another servant signing death warrants. If I refused, I would become another disappearance, another cautionary example, another data point demonstrating why knowledge required control. Either way, the Imperium won. Either way, I lost. The first day passed in silence. I did not leave my cell. I did not eat. I did not pray. I sat on my cot and stared at the grey stone walls. At the prayer stand I could no longer bring myself to kneel before. At the small window that looked out onto an enclosed courtyard where servitors tended gardens of flowering plants whose blooms were genetically engineered to smell like incense. Other archivists walked past my door, their footsteps echoing in the corridor, none of them stopping, none of them knocking, all of them aware that I was under judgment, that I had become contagion, that contact with me risked infection by whatever doubts had compromised my faith. Interrogator Valence appeared briefly in my doorway near midday, her augmetic eyes clicking and whirring as they focused on me, her expression unreadable. She stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, saying nothing, her presence both question and warning. Then she turned and left without speaking, the door sliding shut behind her. I understood what she had communicated. She knew what I knew. She had always known. All of them knew. Every servant of sufficient rank, every interrogator and archivist and administrator who worked in these levels, they knew about the innocent populations destroyed for convenience. They knew about the necessity of darkness and its philosophy of survival through cruelty. They knew because they had made the same choice Morn offered me, had accepted transformation, had traded conscience for utility, had become components in a machine that functioned through their complicity. Valence had not spoken because there was nothing to say, no comfort to offer, no wisdom to share. She had simply come to witness what I would become, whether I would join their ranks or join the disappeared, whether I would accept the truth or become its victim. The second day brought dreams, though I did not remember falling asleep. I dreamed of Temperance Prime, of 17 million people who had never existed in my experience, except as numbers in a file, who had lived and worked and prayed and loved and died for the crime of being inconvenient to powerful interests, whose planet was a crematorium now, whose civilization was ash. I dreamed of walking through their cities before the bombardment, through markets and chapels and schools, past children playing in streets and workers returning from factories and priests conducting evening services. I dreamed of speaking to them, of trying to warn them, but the words caught in my throat and nothing emerged except silence. They looked at me with trust and expectation. These phantom citizens of a dead world, believing I was a servant of the Emperor come to bring news of grace or guidance, not understanding that my very presence marked them for destruction, that the attention of servants like me was diagnosis terminal, that once the Inquisition noticed you, the only question was method of elimination, not whether it would come. I dreamed of the bombardment itself, of watching from orbit as las cannons and plasma torpedoes carved continents into slag, as atmospheric incendiaries turned air into flame, as 17 million souls became 17 million corpses, became 17 million statistics in a file. I would catalogue without comprehension, without grief, without any recognition that each number represented a life as complex and valid as my own. I woke gasping, my robes soaked with sweat despite the cell's cold temperature, my heart hammering against my ribs, but waking changed nothing. The dream remained, or perhaps I remained in it, unable to distinguish between what I had witnessed in sleep and what I witnessed now, the truth that we were all dead already, that the Imperium was a vast necropolis, where the distinction between living and dead mattered less than the distinction between useful and useless, between compliant and complicated, between those who served the machine and those who required elimination to keep it functioning. I had catalogued horrors for 23 years without understanding that I was cataloguing myself, that every name I entered in databases was practice for the day my name would be entered, that the system I served digested its own servants as readily as it digested external threats, that there was no loyalty sufficient to guarantee safety, no faith sufficient to earn mercy, no service sufficient to prevent the moment when utility ended and disposal began. The third day arrived with clarity I had not expected. I rose from my cot and washed with careful attention, dressed in clean robes, arranged my few possessions with deliberate precision. I opened the codex Morn had returned to me and read my own words, the final analytical section where I had stated truth without compromise, without apology, without hope that stating it would matter. And I realized that I had already made my choice, had made it the moment I wrote those words, had made it perhaps years before without recognizing what I was choosing, that every moment of growing doubt had been preparation for this moment, that faith did not shatter suddenly but eroded gradually until one day you recognized it was gone, replaced by something colder and harder and more honest, the simple determination to face what was real rather than comfortable, to acknowledge what you knew rather than pretend ignorance, to accept consequences rather than compromise truth. I would refuse Morn's offer. I would maintain my objections. I would die rather than transform into what the Imperium required, would choose extinction over complicity, would accept erasure over becoming another servant who signed death warrants with steady hands and told himself that necessity justified everything. This was not courage. This was not nobility. This was simply the last choice available to me, the final way to assert that I had existed as something more than component in a machine, that my life had meaning beyond utility, that my conscience mattered, even if only to myself, even if no one else would ever know that I had refused to surrender it. I understood that my death would change nothing, that the Imperium would continue exactly as it had, that Morn would find another archivist to complete similar work, that Operation Cleansing protocols would destroy innocent populations today and tomorrow and forever into the future, that my defiance was futile in every practical sense. But futility did not equal meaninglessness. There was value in refusing to participate in evil, even when refusal changed nothing. Value in bearing witness, even when no one listened. Value in maintaining that individual conscience mattered, even in a system designed to make conscience irrelevant. This was my rebellion, small and doomed and certain to be forgotten, the choice to die as myself, rather than live as something I could not respect, could not accept, could not forgive. I returned to Morn's chambers on the evening of the third day, ascending through the fortress monastery's levels with calm I had not felt in months, carrying the codex though I would not need it, having memorized every word I had written, every truth I had learned, every horror I could no longer unknow. The Crusader guards opened the doors without challenge, and I entered to find Morn standing exactly where he had stood before, watching the mountains through narrow windows while the sun set behind them and darkness claimed the sky. He turned when I entered, his grey eyes meeting mine, reading my answer before I spoke it. I told him that I could not accept his offer, that I could not become what the Imperium required, that I chose to die rather than transform. I told him that I understood this choice served no practical purpose, that it would not change the Inquisition's methods or save any innocent populations or reform the system in any way, that my defiance was symbolic rather than functional, meaningful only to me. I told him that I did not hate him or judge him, that I recognized he carried burdens I could barely imagine, that he had made choices I was fortunate not to face, but that recognizing difficulty did not equal accepting conclusions, that understanding his position did not require me to adopt it. I told him that I had been a faithful servant for 23 years, and I chose to end that service with my integrity intact, with my conscience uncompromised, with whatever remained of my soul still capable of recognizing that some acts were wrong regardless of whether they were necessary, that some prices were too high even when alternatives were worse. I told him that I was grateful he had granted me these 3 days, that the time had allowed me to make peace with my choice, that I was not angry or bitter but simply resolved, that I would face whatever came with the dignity befitting a servant who had done his duty as he understood it, who had served the Imperium with his labor but not his soul, who had remained human even in a system designed to make humanity weakness. Morn listened without interrupting, his expression unchanging, his hands clasped behind his back. When I finished, he remained silent for a long moment, watching me with those grey eyes that carried the weight of centuries and calculations I would never comprehend. Then he spoke, and his voice carried something I had not expected, something that might have been sadness or might have been respect, some acknowledgement that passed between us as one human recognizing another's choice, even while preparing to end them for making it. He said that he had expected my answer, that most servants offered this choice chose as I had chosen. That transformation was rare, not because it was difficult, but because it required surrendering something most people valued more than survival, that conscience was the last fortress, and few willingly surrendered it even to save their lives. He said that my choice was neither courageous nor cowardly, neither wise nor foolish, but simply human, the assertion of individual will against systemic requirement, the refusal to become instrument even when becoming instrument was the price of continuation. He said that he would honor my choice by ensuring my death was quick and painless, that I would be executed within the hour, that my remains would be cremated and scattered without ceremony, that my name would be removed from all records and my existence forgotten within a month, that this was the gentlest ending he could provide given the circumstances. He said that the Imperium would continue without me, that Operation Cleansing protocols would remain in effect, that innocent populations would die tomorrow and the next day and every day afterward, that my defiance changed nothing about the machine's operation, but everything about how I faced its mechanisms. He said that for what little it mattered, he respected my integrity, envied perhaps my ability to still feel that truth mattered more than survival, but that respect changed nothing, that the machine required what it required and destroyed what it could not use, that I had made myself useless by refusing to transform and therefore required elimination. He said these things without malice or pleasure, without anger or sympathy, with the flat affect of someone stating facts rather than judgments, someone who had processed so many deaths that mine was simply another entry in ledgers stretching across centuries, another servant who had learned too much and refused to accept what they learned, another cautionary example in the endless catalogue of why knowledge required control. I asked him one final question. I asked if he believed what he had told me 3 days prior, if he truly thought the Imperium's methods were necessary, if he slept peacefully having signed death warrants for millions, or if somewhere beneath the pragmatism and calculation he recognized that we had become monsters, that we had transformed into the very darkness we claimed to fight, that our survival had been purchased at costs that made survival meaningless. Morn considered my question with the same careful attention he had brought to everything else, his grey eyes distant, his expression thoughtful. Then he said something I had not expected, something that pierced whatever armor I had constructed around myself. He said that he did not know. He said that he had asked himself that same question for 300 years, that he lay awake some nights wrestling with it, that he had never found an answer that satisfied him, that the calculus he performed was not certainty but bet, the wager that survival of humanity through any means was better than extinction through virtue, that maintaining civilization through atrocity was preferable to allowing it to collapse into chaos. He said that he might be wrong. He said that the Inquisition might be wrong. He said that the necessity of darkness might be philosophy built on fear rather than wisdom, rationalization rather than truth. He said that he could not know whether the Imperium's methods were truly necessary or simply familiar, whether we perpetuated cruelty because survival required it or because we had forgotten how to imagine alternatives, whether we fought darkness by becoming darkness, or whether we had simply surrendered to it while calling our surrender strategy. He said that this uncertainty did not change what he did, that he would continue authorizing Operation Cleansing protocols and signing death warrants and making impossible choices regardless of doubt, that the luxury of certainty was not available to anyone with his responsibilities, that he moved forward with incomplete information and imperfect judgment because moving forward was required, because hesitation killed more surely than action, because the machine demanded operation regardless of whether its operators understood its purpose. He said that perhaps this uncertainty was the real burden, worse than the deaths he authorized or the suffering he permitted, the knowledge that everything he did might be wrong, that the foundations upon which the Imperium stood might be quicksand rather than bedrock, that 10,000 years of sacrifice and suffering might be path to nothing except more sacrifice and suffering, that we might be sustaining a civilization that deserved extinction more than preservation, that our descendants might judge us not as saviors, but as the architects of their damnation. This confession broke something in me that I had not known was still intact. I had expected Morn to be certain, to have found the certainty that eluded me, to possess the conviction that justified everything, but he was as uncertain as I was, as troubled as I was, as aware as I was that our choices might be catastrophically wrong, that we might be perpetuating horror not because it saved humanity, but because we could not imagine how to stop, because the machine's momentum carried us forward regardless of individual will or wisdom, because we had become so entangled in systems of our own creation that we could no longer distinguish between what served us and what we served. The difference between us was not knowledge or conviction but choice, the decision he had made to continue operating despite doubt, to sign death warrants while wondering if they were just, to maintain a civilization he was not certain deserved maintenance. He had chosen utility over conscience. I had chosen conscience over utility. Neither choice was clearly correct. Neither choice was clearly wrong. We were both making bets with stakes too high to calculate, wagering our souls on propositions that could not be verified, choosing between forms of damnation that differed only in their particulars. And in that moment I felt something unexpected, something that undid the hatred I had begun to build toward him and the Inquisition and the Imperium itself. I felt pity. Not for myself, though I was about to die. Not for the innocents destroyed by Operation Cleansing protocols, though they deserved it, but for Morn, for every Inquisitor Lord like him, for everyone who bore the burden of impossible choices while doubting whether those choices were right, who signed death warrants while wrestling with uncertainty, who maintained the machine while wondering if the machine deserved maintenance. They were not monsters, they were broken things, servants crushed under weight they could not escape, carrying the Imperium forward not because they believed in it, but because believing did not matter, because forward was the only direction available, because stopping meant admitting that everything they had done was for nothing, that the millions they had killed died without purpose, that the darkness they had become was not strategy but surrender. Morn gestured toward the door, and I understood that our conversation was finished, that he had granted me more time and attention than protocol required, that whatever passed between us changed nothing about what came next. 2 Crusaders entered the chamber, their power armor humming with barely contained energy, their weapons held not in threat but in readiness. I stood from where I had knelt when asking my question and faced them with calm I had not known I possessed. Morn spoke a final time, his voice formal now, stripped of the uncertainty he had briefly revealed. He said that by authority granted him as Inquisitor Lord of the Ordo Hereticus, he judged me compromised by knowledge incompatible with continued service, that my execution was authorized under protocols designed to prevent dissemination of classified doctrine, that my death was not punishment, but pragmatism, necessity, rather than justice. He said that I would be remembered, though not by name, as example of why certain truths required control, why servants required limited access, why the sealed vaults existed to protect not just information but the people who might encounter it. He said that my service had been exemplary until it became dangerous, that the Imperium had benefited from my labor even though it would now erase my existence, that this contradiction was itself example of the impossible calculus he had described, the system that consumed its own servants as readily as its enemies, that recognized no distinction between utility and threat except the moment when one transformed into the other. He said that he wished circumstances were different, but circumstances were what they were, that he respected my choice even while ending me for making it, that he hoped I found whatever peace existed beyond the certainty of death, though he did not believe such peace existed, thought more likely that we simply stopped, that consciousness ended and nothing came after, that our sacrifices and sufferings and choices mattered only in the moments we made them and not at all once we were gone. He said that this absence of meaning did not make meaning irrelevant, that we created significance through choice regardless of whether that significance persisted, that my death would be meaningless to everyone except myself, but that myself was enough, that living and dying according to conscience had value even when value could not be measured or preserved, that I had chosen well even if I had chosen doom. The Crusaders escorted me from Morn's chambers. their hands on my shoulders, not restraining but guiding, their power armor's servo motors whirring softly as we walked. We descended through the fortress monastery, not to the archives, but to a lower level I had never visited, a place of bare stone corridors and automated security measures, of sealed doors and flickering lumen strips that cast everything in shades of amber and shadow. This was where the Inquisition performed tasks that required privacy absolute, where interrogations became executions, where servants disappeared into silence. We passed no one. We encountered no other personnel. The fortress monastery might have been abandoned, emptied of everyone except our small procession moving deeper into stone, toward an ending that had been inevitable from the moment I entered the sealed vaults 3 months prior, from the moment I allowed comprehension to crack my faith, from the moment I chose truth over comfortable ignorance. The Crusaders brought me to a chamber that was neither large nor small, a cube of grey stone perhaps 5 meters on each side, lit by a single overhead lumen that cast sharp shadows. In the center of the floor was a drain, ancient iron stained with residue that might have been rust or might have been something else. Against one wall stood a servitor, its organic components withered to the point of being barely recognizable as once human, its mechanical components clean and well maintained, its eyes glowing red in the dimness. In its right hand, it held an executioner's pistol, a weapon designed for single purpose, ornate and precise, and entirely efficient. The Crusaders positioned me before the servitor and stepped back, their role completed. The door through which we had entered slid shut with finality that was almost peaceful, the sound of a book closing, of a story ending, of certainty arriving after long uncertainty. I stood alone with the servitor in that grey stone chamber, and I thought about all the people who had stood here before me, servants who had learned too much or questioned too loudly or failed in some way that made them liabilities rather than assets, who had faced what I faced now with varying degrees of acceptance or resistance, fear or courage, regret or resolution. How many had there been across the centuries? How many would come after me? How many execution chambers like this one existed throughout the Imperium? How many servitors waited in grey stone rooms with executioners' pistols? How many archives maintained files of the disappeared, the erased, the servants who had outlived their utility and required elimination? I thought about Temperance Prime and Gradius Nines and Monarch's Rest and all the worlds whose names I had learned in the sealed vaults, the innocent populations destroyed not through malice but mathematics, not through corruption but policy, not through failure but design. I thought about interrogator Katrin Voss, who had written honest reports and disappeared. I thought about all the other interrogators and archivists who had asked questions that made them dangerous, who had failed the test I had failed, who had valued conscience over utility and paid with their existence. I thought about Morn, lying awake in his chambers 300 years into service, wrestling with uncertainty, signing death warrants while doubting whether those deaths were necessary, maintaining a civilization he could not be certain deserved maintenance. I thought about the Emperor, whoever or whatever he had been. The vision that had launched all of this, the attempt to unite humanity that had created instead this vast machine of suffering, this empire that consumed its own citizens as readily as its enemies, this civilization that had forgotten any purpose beyond perpetuation. Had he known what would become of his dream? Had he understood that creating an empire required becoming empire, that fighting monsters required becoming monstrous, that the only way to hold together something so vast was through mechanisms so terrible they corroded the very humanity they were meant to preserve? Or had he been uncertain too, another broken thing crushed under impossible burden, doing what he thought necessary while doubting whether necessity was wisdom, creating the Imperium not because it was right, but because he could not imagine alternatives? The servitor raised the executioner's pistol, and I did not close my eyes. I wanted to see the ending, wanted to witness my own death with the same unflinching attention I had brought to cataloguing deaths in the archives for 23 years, wanted to face the moment rather than flee from it. The pistol's barrel was ornate, engraved with prayers and purity seals, a weapon that transformed execution into sacrament, that dressed murder in devotional language, that made ending someone's life seem holy rather than practical. I wondered who maintained these weapons, who cleaned and blessed and prepared them for use, whether they understood the irony of sanctifying instruments of murder, whether they prayed for the souls they helped to extinguish, or whether they processed their work the same way I had processed mine, as duty divorced from moral weight, as service that required only precision and not conscience. The servitor's red eyes were steady, unblinking, mechanical. It felt no malice toward me. It felt nothing at all. It was simply performing its function, executing a command given by some distant administrator who had marked my name for deletion, translating bureaucratic decision into physical reality. I was not person to it. I was not even enemy. I was task, objective, item to be processed and completed and forgotten. And in that transformation from person to task, I understood the final truth the sealed vaults had to teach me, the ultimate revelation about how the Imperium functioned and why it could not be reformed or redeemed. We had built a system that depended on viewing people as abstractions, that required servants to process lives as data and deaths as statistics, that could only operate by training everyone within it to forget that numbers represented human beings with hopes and fears and loves as real as their own. This was not accident or corruption, but design, necessary architecture for managing civilization at such scale, the only way to make decisions about millions without being paralyzed by empathy for individuals. The Imperium survived by making us inhuman, by teaching us to ignore the weight of individual existence, by requiring that we process horror without feeling it. And once you learned to view your enemies as abstractions, learned to authorize their destruction without grief, you inevitably began viewing everyone as abstractions, your fellow servants and yourself included, all of us components in a machine that measured worth purely by utility and discarded whatever ceased to serve. The servitor's finger tightened on the trigger, and I had time for one final thought, one last reflection before my consciousness ended, and whatever I was became nothing, scattered atoms and fading electrical impulses, and eventually not even that, just absence, just space where something had been. My final thought was not fear or regret, not anger or sorrow, not prayer or plea. My final thought was gratitude, strange and unexpected, gratitude for the knowledge that had brought me to this chamber, for the truths I had learned in the sealed vaults, even though those truths had destroyed me, for the understanding that made continued service impossible, but made dying possible, made dying meaningful, made dying the last honest act available to me. I had spent 23 years as a faithful servant, cataloging horrors without comprehension, processing atrocity as duty, believing that every act of violence served a greater purpose. I had died in the sealed vaults, killed not by revelation but by understanding, killed by the accumulation of evidence that could not be denied or rationalized or explained away, killed by the slow erosion of faith until nothing remained except clear sight, except the ability to see what was actually there rather than what I wanted to believe existed. And in the 3 days since I had made my choice, the choice to refuse transformation and accept execution, I had been alive in a way I had never been before, had felt more human than I had felt in decades, had discovered that consciousness itself, that individual will itself, that conscience itself had value independent of whether expressing it achieved any practical purpose, that the mere act of choosing truth over lies and death over complicity was affirmation of something that mattered, something the Imperium could erase but not defeat, something that persisted as long as single individuals chose to honor it, even when honoring it cost them everything. I was grateful for the choice I had made. I was grateful for the clarity that had come with comprehension. I was grateful that I would die as myself, rather than transform into what the Imperium required. I was grateful that my name would be erased, and my existence forgotten, because that erasure meant I had been dangerous, had represented some threat to the machine, had valued something more than my utility, and therefore proved that utility was not all that mattered, that conscience existed, that truth existed, that resistance existed, even if only in the form of individual refusal, individual acceptance that some prices were too high, some transformations too terrible, some compromises too complete. The executioner's pistol fired, and there was light and sound and the sensation of falling forward, though I did not feel myself hit the stone floor, and there was darkness, immediate and total, consciousness ending not gradually but instantly. The world vanishing between one moment and the next with no transition or pain or final understanding, just cessation, just ending, just the extinguishing of the small flame that had been Silas Dren, archivist of the 4th rank, servant of the Ordo Hereticus, cataloguer of horrors who learned to see what he catalogued, who failed the test of comprehension by refusing to accept what he comprehended, who chose death over transformation and erasure over utility, who maintained that conscience mattered even in a system designed to make conscience irrelevant, who bore witness to truths that would never be acknowledged or reformed or even remembered by anyone except the next archivist who would be granted access to the sealed vaults and would repeat this cycle, this pattern, this terrible education in what the Imperium was and required, who might make the same choice or different choice but would make it alone, isolated by knowledge that could not be shared, destroyed by understanding that could not be survived. I am dead now. I have been dead for centuries by the time you read this. If you read this, if this account somehow survived the protocols designed to eliminate all evidence of my existence, I am dead, but the Imperium continues. I am dead, but Operation Cleansing protocols continue. I am dead, but innocent populations continue dying for the crime of being inconvenient, for the sin of being noticed by servants who measure worth in utility and discard whatever ceases to serve. I am dead, but nothing has changed except that one archivist refused to participate in what he finally understood, refused to transform into instrument, refused to make peace with atrocity. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the mere fact of refusal has value even when refusal changes nothing. Perhaps bearing witness matters even when no one is listening. Perhaps dying with conscience intact is victory of a kind, small and quiet, and certain to be forgotten but real nonetheless. More real than the victories celebrated in official records, more honest than the salvation promised by Imperial doctrine, more meaningful than survival purchased through becoming something you cannot respect. The Emperor knows if he exists. The Emperor judges if he cares. The Emperor preserves those who serve him faithfully, or so we are taught, or so I believed before I learned what faithful service required. Before I understood that the most faithful servants are those who never comprehend what they serve, who never question what they witness, who never look beneath the surface of necessary evil to discover that evil is not necessity but choice, not tragedy but policy, not failure but foundation. I served faithfully for 23 years and my reward was knowledge I could not unknow, understanding I could not accept, clarity that destroyed me. I do not regret it. I am grateful for every moment in the sealed vaults. I am grateful for every file that cracked my faith. I am grateful for the truth that killed me. I am grateful that I died as human being rather than lived as machine component, that my last act was refusal rather than acceptance, that my final choice honored something beyond survival, beyond utility, beyond the calculating pragmatism that maintains an empire not worth maintaining, that preserves a civilization not worth preserving, that sacrifices millions to save billions without asking whether the billions saved are better off than the millions sacrificed. The answer is that they are not. We are not. The Imperium is darkness, pretending to be light, tyranny, pretending to be salvation, horror, pretending to be necessity. And knowing this changes nothing except the person who knows it, transforms the servant into witness, transforms the component into conscience, transforms the instrument into the thing that must be eliminated because instruments with conscience cannot be relied upon to perform their function without question, without doubt, without the possibility of refusal.